I'm J.G. Michael, and this is Parallax Views. This edition of Parallax Views is brought to you by the $10 and above tier supporters of Parallax Views on Patreon. So, with that in mind, producers credit shoutouts to Galen, Matt, Gunnar, Mark, Simon, Alexander, Catherine, G, Tilo, Emilia, Jeremy, Jeff, John, Bert, Brian, Elliot, Michael, Brace, James, Nick, Mersham, Galen, Gareth, Arlen, Bo, Christopher, Michael, Gigadelic Media, Will, Chance, Chase, Dan, Big Bob, David H, Y. Kellerman, Sadeed 13, Kathleen, David, Ava, Bob, The West Bank Robbery Podcast, Jamie, Enoch, Gary, Max, Ishtofer, James, Martin, Matthew Ho, Brian, Nobody, Thomas, and Dano. And now on to the show. Hey there, Parallax Views listeners. As always, before we begin this edition of the program, I want to remind you that it is you, the listener, that will help to make sure this show continues going forward in the future, because I am currently without any advertisers or sponsors. So it is you, the listener, that I am depending on for donations that will help to keep this show alive. And you can make a donation, a monthly donation, at patreon.com/parallaxviews. One more time, that's patreon.com/parallaxviews. If you've already donated, thank you. If you haven't, please consider doing so. And with that out of the way, on this edition of the program, we're going to be talking about Israel's ban of UNRWA, the United Nations Relief and Works Agency for Palestine refugees in the Near East. And we're going to be doing that with a former chief spokesperson of UNRWA, namely Chris Gunness, who served as UNRWA's Director of Communications and Advocacy from 2007 to 2020. I want to get right to the conversation. This is a very important story. The UNRWA ban is going to have some big consequences for both Palestinians and Israelis. As Chris argues, it's not good for anyone. So with that being said, let's get right to it with Chris Gunness. Welcome to Parallax Views, a guest that I'm very happy to have on, Chris Gunness of UNRWA's, formerly of UNRWA's Director of Communications and Advocacy from 2007 until 2020. How are you doing?
I'm good, thank you, my friend. How are you?
I'm doing well, and I'm so happy to have you on because I recently had a chance to read an article you wrote in The New Arab. UNRWA's expulsion from Jerusalem will seal Israel's illegal annexation. And then there was an article in Haaretz that I wanted to speak with you about as well, entitled Expelling UNRWA Punishes Palestinians, but it's also dangerous for Israel and the hostages. Maybe you could tell my listeners what exactly is happening with regards to UNRWA and Israel right now. I know there's been, spats between the two, but things are about to get very bad.
Yeah. Perhaps it's useful I begin by giving a thumbnail sketch of what UNRWA is, because it's a very ungainly acronym and many people don't understand what it is. Essentially, UNRWA was created in the wake of the 1948 Middle East War, which saw 750,000 people either expelled or forcibly displaced from their homes. And they went north up into Lebanon, northeast to Syria, eastwards into Jordan, stayed in the West, or went into the West Bank, and some went down into Gaza. And UNRWA was charged initially with doing job creation, but then when it became clear that the refugees weren't going to go home to Israel, which is, or historic Palestine would have then become Israel, the agency, UNRWA, started to do longer-term development work. So that meant basically health and education, providing housing as well, the things that refugees needed. And 70-something years later, started on the ground in 1948, it's morphed into a huge quasi-governmental organization. Its education department delivers education for over 500,000 children across the Middle East, huge number of health clinics. It's almost like a health ministry, and so on and so forth. And it has huge operations in Gaza, where 66% of the population are registered with UNRWA. And there it also does emergency work. So as this Israeli blockade, this illegal collective punishment as defined by international law, has taken its toll, UNRWA's been forced to give food, for example, to people because there simply isn't enough food in Gaza, emergency medical interventions, relief and social services. So that's really what was at stake when this terrible war started. Of course, for many Palestinians, the war in 1948 never ended, but this latest manifestation of the war saw UNRWA caught in the middle. Now, Israel wasted no time in accusing UNRWA. It said that 12 of its staff had been involved in the attack, this brutal attack, which everyone has condemned, in October 2023. And to put it bluntly, Israel, as the head of the United Nations humanitarian arm, Tom Fletcher, has said Israel has produced absolutely no evidence whatsoever to substantiate its claims. Nonetheless, in October last year, October the 28th, the Israeli parliament, the Knesset, passed two pieces of legislation ending the so-called cooperation by the State of Israel with UNRWA and making it illegal for any Israeli citizen or entity to engage with UNRWA. Now, the countdown for that legislation, 90 days, began on the 28th of October, and 90 days later is the 26th of January, which is coming up quite soon. And on that day, particularly UNRWA services in Gaza are going to come into question, because in order to get staff into Gaza, they have to go through the Israeli blockade. They have to go through IDF checkpoints, Israeli army checkpoints. And if the Israeli army are not even acknowledging UNRWA, then clearly it can't get through a highly militarized checkpoint. And it also means that international staff, at least, can't get out. So there are about 7,000 UNRWA staff in Gaza still working, which is remarkable all the way through the war. They've continued to give food aid to nearly 2 million people. They've continued to deliver sanitation, housing services in UNRWA facilities. They've continued to deliver health facilities. And by the way, 2/3 of the 4,000 plus trucks waiting to get into Gaza belong to UNRWA. So that gives you some idea, I think, of the magnitude of UNRWA's operations in Gaza, but also an idea of the magnitude of what will be lost if UNRWA is not allowed to continue its life-saving services in Gaza. And one very good example of that is the fact that UNRWA has been supporting the polio vaccinations, a huge program of polio vaccinations, which have been taking place in UNRWA facilities. So a lot is at stake here.
If you could, I know you talked about Gaza there. What does this mean, for the West Bank and East Jerusalem?
Right. Yeah, I mean, that's a very good question. And in the op-eds which you referenced in your very kind introduction, I argue, and I think a lot of people who actually understand the implications of the international law and the operational implications agree with this. And that is that in East Jerusalem, UNRWA has 10 schools, it has a vocational training center, it has health clinics, which serve 63 and a bit thousand people. So first of all, if those operations were to cease, then it would very, very negatively impact over 60,000 people. So that's one's first concern. But there is also UNRWA's massive 9-acre compound headquarters building in the Sheikh Jarrah neighborhood of East Jerusalem. It's where my office used to be. It's where the Commissioner General and his key staff have offices. It's also the headquarters of UNRWA's West Bank operation, from which a lot of the aid, the food, the medicines go through into UNRWA facilities across the West Bank. So those might well be severely impacted, because just to get staff into those facilities, international staff, they have to get Israeli visas. And so after the 26th of January, it may be impossible to get Israelis to actually service these visas, because technically under the law, that would be a violation, that would be a breaking of the law. But there's perhaps a more significant political import to all of this, and that is that since 1967, since the beginning of the occupation, when Israel illegally annexed East Jerusalem, I mean, not a single country in the world, arguably the United States, which moved its embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, but the vast majority, with the exception perhaps only of the United States and Israel, the vast majority of member states of the United Nations do not accept the annexation, but a de facto annexation has gone on. So Israel has slowly imposed its own legal system, its own rules, its own authority through the Jerusalem municipality on Palestinian Authority facilities in East Jerusalem, but also on UNRWA. It's now saying it's going to shut down UNRWA's headquarters in Jerusalem and take over the schools, the training center, the health clinics, etc. And that would effectively set the seal on Israel's illegal annexation of Jerusalem. Jerusalem would de facto be incorporated into West Jerusalem as the eternal and undivided capital of the Jewish state. Now, at that point, Jerusalem gets taken off the peace process, gets taken off the peace table. And that has huge significance because, going back to the Middle Ages, Jerusalem is a place over which crusades were fought. And it's certainly a place over which jihads, holy wars, have been declared in recent history. And of course, often Israeli control over East Jerusalem has led to clashes, the Intifada, for example. And so there are serious political implications. There are serious humanitarian implications for UNRWA's beneficiaries. And there are very serious political implications in relation to the peace process.
So we're talking here really about the expulsion of UNRWA from occupied East Jerusalem. Mm-hmm. Right.
Pretty much. I think expulsion is probably the right word.
There was also an interesting portion of your article where we can draw some conclusions from all of this, including what Israeli authorities plan to do with, say, the UNRWA schools. Can we talk about some of the implications?
Sure. Yeah. So in a letter from Israel's ambassador to the United Nations in New York, from the Israeli ambassador to the United Nations in New York, to the president of the General Assembly, which he asked should be distributed among all nearly 200 member states of the General Assembly, the Israeli ambassador made clear that the Israeli authorities would take over UNRWA's education and health services. And that seemed a pretty clear signal that UNRWA staff would not be allowed to run those services, and that these would be taken over by the Jerusalem municipality. And it's also been made clear that UNRWA's headquarters that I've just been describing would also be taken over. And the Israeli Land Authority, so it's reported, may be planning to hand that vast headquarters compound over to illegal Jewish settlers to turn into nearly 1,500 housing units. Now, this really does mean that it becomes a fact on the ground. And, the history of since 1967, and perhaps even before that, has shown that Israel has been allowed by the international community, particularly by the Americans, to have this de facto creeping annexation and to have this with complete impunity. I mean, Israel's never really had to pay a price for its flagrant and widespread and blatant violation of international law. And when you look at the sorts of things that Mr. Trump, now President Trump, has been saying, you really have to wonder how serious the government in Washington is about leaning on Israel to abide by international law. And of course, under international law, those settlements and this annexation of Jerusalem is completely illegal and should be rolled back. But, it's hard to see President Trump in his second term, for which there are classically no consequences for a US president. It's hard to see him taking any meaningful action to roll this illegality back, in spite of the fact, I might add, Michael, that the International Court of Justice in July, in an advisory opinion, ruled effectively that the Israeli occupation was illegal because it deprived Palestinians of the right to self-determination, an inalienable right, and also because it imposed an apartheid system. And apartheid is, in international law, a very specific crime. And the ICJ, the world's highest court, was effectively saying Israel is committing the crime of apartheid. It is denying the Palestinians the right to self-determination. And not only must the occupation be ended immediately, but member states of the United Nations must take no action whatsoever to be complicit in this illegal occupation. And that means basically, so many legal scholars would argue, that means cutting off all trade relations, military relationships, diplomatic relationships with the state of Israel, because it is the state of Israel that enables this illegal occupation of Palestine. So, you know, it's got serious, serious consequences, this whole business of Israel passing this legislation and seeking to destroy UNRWA. And I think anyone who believes in peace in the Middle East, not least the Arabs, who of course have a real stake in the future of Jerusalem. It's the third holiest shrine in Islam after Mecca and Medina. But I think the rest of the international community does also. If you believe in the international rule of law, if you believe that you should be able to say to Putin, you can't acquire land by force and keep it, so you should feel that you can say to Netanyahu and his very right, far-right administration, people in his cabinet and in his coalition, you should be able to say to them too, you cannot acquire land by force. So, you know, if you're going to say to Netanyahu, you can get away with this, well, you know, Putin will think, well, I can get away with this too. And you know what? I mean, perhaps under Mr. Trump, he will say, I want peace, and you can keep the Donbass. You can keep 20% of East, of Ukraine, that bit in Eastern Ukraine they have. So it has, you know, it may seem like a small bureaucratic thing, the expulsion of UNRWA from East Jerusalem, but it's part of something much bigger. And I think that does have very, very profound consequences for the rest of the world.
One of the most interesting aspects of your article, and I'm going to ask you about this because I have listeners that are Palestinian, Palestinian American, and I have Jewish American and even Israeli listeners. And you make the argument that this isn't even good for Israel. Can you explain that a little bit?
Yeah, so I mean, what we're seeing now is international law basically turning on Israel. And this, and it's not even turning on Israel, it's just saying to Israel, you need not to be a criminal state. And to avoid being a criminal state, you need to abide by international law. So after the beginning of the action in October 2023, South Africa brought a case at the International Court of Justice in which it argued that a genocide was taking place. And it was joined by other states who were basically arguing the same thing. And then in January 2023, the court turned around and said, we are worried about this plausible genocide, and we demand that Israel take various actions in order to make sure that the rights of the people that are being attacked in Gaza are not violated in a manner which violates the Genocide Convention. So Israel, for example, was told to open up all the crossings to let in humanitarian aid, the accusation being that food was being used as an instrument of war, which of course is a real violation of the convention. And a whole series of other what they call provisional measures were imposed on Israel, which Israel has basically completely ignored. Then you had follow-up action by the court, which again had more provisional measures for Israel. And each time the world, as embodied in the General Assembly, looked at this and said, we have a member state that's actively committing violations of international law. Then we had the Israeli attack on UNRWA. We had the 2 Knesset bills at the end of October. And again, for members of the General Assembly, they're looking at this member state declaring war on a UN agency that's doing for this state what the state itself, should be doing under the laws of occupation. And then we look at the fact that as of the 9th of January, 260-something UNRWA staff have been killed in attacks by the Israeli army. So many of that half, if not more, of UNRWA's facilities have either been damaged or destroyed by the Israeli army. The office where I used to work in Gaza is now a smoldering heap of rubble. And then, of course, you have the action at the International Criminal Court, which the ICJ adjudicates cases between states. The ICC is about individuals being pursued by the International Court. And what you had there is Karim Khan, the prosecutor, going to the pretrial chamber and getting it to authorize an arrest warrant for Yoav Gallant, the Israeli, then now resigned Israeli defense minister, and Prime Minister Netanyahu, and several of the Hamas leaders who've been killed, assassinated by Israel. So you've now got Yoav Gallant, the former Israeli defense minister, and Netanyahu, effectively wanted alleged war criminals. Now, the General Assembly looks at that and says, what can we possibly do to bring Israel to its senses and bring Israel into compliance with international law? And there is a move, I can tell you, which is advancing, with each day, to have Israel expelled from the General Assembly, just as apartheid South Africa was expelled from the General Assembly. So when I argue that this is not good for Israel, it just isn't good for any country, any member state of the United Nations, to behave in a manner which is so flagrantly violating international law that the General Assembly kicks it out. Nobody, I would hope, in Israel, bar the most isolationist, perhaps religious, I don't know, perhaps most far-right person, would actually want to live in a state which is threatened as apartheid South Africa was, with embargoes and blockades and pariahdom. I mean, that's what it wants. And that is not what the decent Israelis I know and love want to happen to their country. And, that's why I argue, what Israel is looking at in the face at is economic, military, diplomatic blockade, isolation, and pariah status. I mean, that's why I say that it's not good for Israel. And this latest move to expel UNRWA is just another nail in that coffin, I'm afraid.
Just a few more questions here. One that's very important to me is, we mentioned the seemingly trying to get rid of these UNRWA schools and replace it with, Israeli education that would essentially leave out, the Palestinian perspective when teaching, these refugees. So I wanted to talk a little bit more about that and just, do you think any of this can really succeed? Because I think you say in the article, this will fail. I mean, this attempt to remove the Palestinian refugees and their inalienable rights from the peace process will fail. I don't think any attempts to brainwash a population or to suppress their desire for sovereignty is going to work. Why is that?
Well, there are two aspects to this question. One is around the status of the refugees, and one is around education and textbooks. So to deal with the education textbooks first, Israel has alleged, and Israel and its various acolytes and Hasbara, as they say, Israeli kind of persuasion organizations, or however you translate Hasbara, have argued that UNRWA's textbooks teach terrorism, jihadism, they are anti-Semitic, they're anti-Israel. It's the matter is simply this: UNRWA in its schools teaches the curriculum of the host authorities. So in Jordan, it teaches the Jordanian curriculum; in Syria, the Syrian curriculum; in Lebanon, the Lebanese curriculum; and in Palestine, in Gaza, the West Bank, it teaches the curriculum of the Palestinian Authority. And that's because it's preparing kids for exams in those places. So if you're going to prepare kids for exams in Syria, you kind of need to teach them the Syrian textbooks. And that's precisely what UNRWA does in Palestine. Now, the Palestinian curriculum was devised by Palestinians, scholars, educationalists, people dealing in pedagogy, human rights organizations, historians, academics, all sorts of people, just like the textbooks in Germany or in America are created by people who know about history and geography and human rights and social groups and parents groups and religious groups and whoever. And that's a matter of national sovereignty. a UN organization couldn't turn up in America and say, oh, we're going to teach a different textbook. We're not going to teach, the history of America in the way that Americans want the history taught. And so UNRWA really has no choice but to accept the sovereign nature of this decision and to say that it's a matter of Palestinian sovereign rights, that they get taught their own textbooks. Nonetheless, in the face of huge objections from the PA, from the Palestinian Authority, UNRWA has conducted over the years a program of education reform, and it reviews the textbooks, the PA textbooks, and where they feel that those textbooks don't accord with UN values, then it produces alternative materials for the teachers to teach, whether it's sort of geography, year 2, term 3, week 1, lesson 2, whatever it might be. And the teacher will get materials or are encouraged to teach materials which are in accordance with UN values. And generally, this is around 3 areas. 1, age-appropriate violence. So if UNRWA felt that there was a depiction of something which was just not appropriate for an 8-year-old, then it would be changed. Gender representation. So if the UNRWA department, the education department, felt that what was in a textbook was sexist or misogynistic or not in accordance with the dignity which one must afford women, then it would be changed. And the other is political neutrality. So if it's felt that the state of Israel or any politics is too extreme for children of whatever age it may be to learn, then it provides alternative materials. And that's really what UNRWA has done. And it's done it to the satisfaction of all our major donors. Otherwise, why would they carry on funding them? Of course, the Americans have completely withdrawn. And under President Trump, I guess they're likely to continue to do that. So, that's where the education issue stands. I would argue that UNRWA has done everything that's humanly possible to reform its education, and that there is absolutely no reason now to say that there is a reason to hold back funds or to push. UNRWA is aware of the issues. UNRWA, as textbooks come in at the beginning of every academic year, it does these reviews and it puts out, as I say, materials to its teachers. Now, on the question of refugee status, which is the second part of the answer to this question, Israel believes erroneously that UNRWA is pushing the right of return for its registered refugees, of which there are 5.9 million. Now, that is simply a lie. It's not true. The question of the right of return, as far as UNRWA is concerned, is up to the refugees, and it needs to be resolved, as in all refugee returns after a conflict, by the parties involved. So UNRWA is not pushing. UNRWA is saying that the refugees have the right to 3 choices that all refugees in the world have. They have the right to stay where they are, local integration. They have the right to go to a third country integration. So, if America or Canada decides it wants to give visas to Palestinian refugees, they can do that. Or they have the right of return. And that's the 3 classic choices that refugees everywhere in the world have always had. So this idea that UNRWA is pushing this particular thing. Now, Israel thinks that if it gets rid of UNRWA, it somehow will get rid of the right of return, it will get rid of refugee status, it will get rid of the collective memories, the collective rights, and all those things that they think UNRWA comes to represent. But that's not true. I mean, UNRWA could disappear this afternoon, and the fact is that these people would remain refugees with inalienable rights. It's as mad to think of as getting rid of UNRWA would get rid of refugees as thinking that getting rid of Oxfam would get rid of poverty, or getting rid of Save the Children would get rid of children. I mean, it's just a crazy notion. And that's why I say it's destined to fail, because these people will remain. They will continue to have children, which, as in all refugee populations, the children will be registered as refugees. The idea that this will suddenly that 6 million people will just go away, is just crazy. I mean, to put it in one word.
I just had 2 more questions. I was wondering, so for my listeners that have only heard about UNRWA in the news, or they've only heard the op-eds attacking UNRWA, what do you want to say to them if there's any misconceptions about UNRWA? And I wanted to state real quick, even with all the talk of UNRWA and Hamas, I mean, my understanding is that UNRWA has employed in the past at least 13,000 people in Gaza. So, of those 13,000, someone is going to know someone involved with Hamas if they're in Gaza just because Hamas was the dominant force, has been the
Yeah,
dominant force. So that's my
yeah.
response to that. But what is your response to the sort of attacks on UNRWA?
Well, first of all, the context of this conversation is the dispossession of the Palestinians that took place in 1948, the occupation of Palestine, which began in 1967, and the blockade of Gaza, the most cruel and inhumane trade embargo in the history of trade relations, which began in 2007. So, if I surrounded whichever part of the US you're speaking from and put tanks all around it, built a fence around it, refused to allow you to trade or to do exports, refused to allow people to come in and out, and then took away your army, you might be forgiven for smashing down the fence and breaking out and committing acts of violence. I'm not for a moment justifying the violence that was committed. I'm just saying it has a context. And for many Palestinians, that is something which you need to look at, and you need to acknowledge that they have had these barbarities perpetrated against them. And for them, it's like a sort of anti-colonial uprising. What is a colonized people supposed to do when they've been deprived of their army? And this occupying army for decades has simply refused to budge, refused to engage in any conversations about ending the occupation, ending this colonial, militaristic, belligerent occupation. So there's that. But the other point I generally make on this is that there was, after Israel's accusations, an external to the UN investigation, an inquiry. There was an internal one and an external one. When the external one, which was by a former French foreign minister called Catherine Colonna, she produced her report, and in it, very conspicuously, she said, Israel has produced no evidence to substantiate its claims against UNRWA, not one. So Israel accused UNRWA staff of taking part in these attacks. When it came to providing evidence that would stand up, they produced nothing. There were lots of accusations. That your car was over here, and we think this is this, and we saw on a video of that. When it came to providing the external independent investigation with evidence that would stand up to scrutiny, Israel could produce none. So all I would say was, whatever people say about members of, sympathizers with Hamas, blah, 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 when push came to shove and Israel had to provide evidence to the external inquiry, it produced none. Zippo, zilch, niet, nada.
And the last question I had, and this is how we'll close it, is if you were to say, what are your biggest concerns? What are the concerns you have right now? And what do you want my listeners to get out of this conversation? What are the biggest points you want them to take from this?
Well, the biggest immediate point is Gaza, because we've now got a ceasefire and we have to make sure the ceasefire sticks and moves from phase one, which must be complete in the next 1/2 days, into the next 42/41 days, during which 33 hostages, getting my numbers muddled up here. So we have to make sure it moves from the 42-day first stage into the second and third phase. And I have no doubt that what can best be done to ensure the success of this is to flood Gaza with humanitarian aid. All the crossings have to be open 24/7, and food and water and medicine and hygiene kits and sanitation kits for women, and equipment has got to be got in for clearing rubble. There's 50 million tons of rubble under which there's unexploded ordnance. Families are now going back, particularly to the north, and when they get there, they're going to find the decomposing and dismembered bodies of their relatives, friends, families, loved ones who are trapped under the rubble. Well, they've got to somehow dig them out and give a dignified end on this earth to their families and their loved ones. They've got to be fed, they've got to be housed, they've got to be clothed, there's got to be medicine, they've got to clear. This stuff has to happen rapidly. And for that to happen, they have to move into Gaza industrial scale humanitarian aid and equipment. And desperate, starving, thirsty, hungry, angry people do not make partners for peace. And it only takes one little incident, like someone getting hold of a rocket and firing it into Israel, for this whole thing, this tinderbox, to be reunited again. So phase one of the ceasefire is very fragile. That's my biggest concern. My concern is that Netanyahu, clearly it's in the interest of his political survival for the war to start again, and also it's in the interest perhaps of his coalition staying together if the war starts again. So there's many reasons why this is fragile. There's many reasons why it could go wrong. There's many reasons why we could return to what Amnesty International, for example, has concluded is a genocide. So that's my big concern. My second big concern, I think, is the politics around this. I think that UNRWA must survive. I think that not just what I've been talking about, flooding Gaza with aid, that is only possible if UNRWA's massive network of warehouses, food distribution centers, vehicles, staff, all of that stuff, UNRWA must survive, I think, and must be put into fifth gear if the phase one of the plan is going to succeed, moving into phases 2 and 3. I think when it comes to reconstruction and mine clearance, I think UNRWA's massive engineering department is going to be supporting all of that, and therefore, that is all crucial as well. So point number 2, beyond the immediate emergency aid that UNRWA is going to be crucial to delivering, UNRWA is going to be vital and must survive in the recovery and reconstruction phase. And then, when eventually we move to a bigger plan for peace in the Middle East, UNRWA's work throughout the region, educating 500,000 plus children around the Middle East, bringing relief and social services to some of the most disadvantaged communities across the Middle East, food aid for millions of people, psychosocial support for children and babies in trauma, support for women, single mothers whose husbands have been killed in various wars. That's the kind of human capital which UNRWA brings to these desperate communities. And without it, I have no doubt that the Middle East is an inherently far more unstable place, and the prospect for peace in the tinderbox that is Israel today are pushed back immeasurably. To be clear, if Israel is going to exist secure, with its Arab states securing and ensuring its security, then the Palestinians have to be given a fully functioning state. Their dignity, their humanity must be respected. And the role of UNRWA in that is absolutely 1,000% essential.
Well, I want to thank you again, Chris Gunness, for coming on Parallax Views. Is there any way that my listeners can keep up with the current work you're doing, or is there anything you want to plug here at the end?
Well, it's very kind of you. I mean, the truth is my day job is to run a thing called the Myanmar Accountability Project. I have a long association with Myanmar, and I run a little organization called the Myanmar Accountability Project, which does criminal litigations against war criminals in the Myanmar junta. And we do that. We've got cases in Philippines, in Indonesia, in Turkey, in the UK. We're starting a case in Timor-Leste. So that really is what I do. And if you want to keep up, we have a website, and I could perhaps send it to you after this interview, and you could post it on your website.
Sounds good. Thank you very much for coming on Parallax Views.
Very good to be with you. Thank you so much for having me.
Well, that does it for this edition of Parallax Views. As always, if you appreciate the work here I do at Parallax Views, please consider supporting me on Patreon at patreon.com/parallaxviews. One more time, that's patreon.com/parallaxviews. And with that being said, until next time, you've been listening to Parallax Views with Parallax Views to Parallax Views with Parallax Views.
The way out is not simply to say don't do it, just to prohibit. It's nothing else. If we don't do it, others will be doing it like crazy. So, we have to confront the problem. But no, basically, I know of the great anxieties, problems, new forms of control, but it's also new forms of freedom. This is why I always emphasize that internet and all this new digital stuff, it's a very ambiguous phenomenon, but it's the field of struggle. new forms of enslavement, but at the same time, new incredible forms of freedom. We have to accept the fight with no nostalgia for old, allegedly more authentic communities or whatever. I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid.